what we're seeing play out before us is psychological warfare within the political arena, because psychological warfare is the primary warfare. The left, going way back to the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, and the Frankfurt School was a group of Marxist intellectuals who were trained by the KGB in Moscow, and then they picked up and moved to Frankfurt, Germany in the 1920s. And their strategy was not to do the guns and bullets thing, but to create a Marxist revolution or a communist revolution in America via radically transforming the culture. And that means political correctness. And there are four top targets, by the way, of the Marxist intellectuals in the 1920s. The four top targets was number one, they said destroy Christianity. Number two, destroy the Christian marriage. Number three, destroy Christian morality, family values. And then number four, destroy patriotism, destroy any patriotic feelings or belief in an independent sovereign nation state like America. Now, that's their four primary targets. So these Marxist intellectuals, and Sigmund Freud was involved, and Sigmund Freud was, pathologically sick. He was mentally ill himself. The guy was a cocaine addict, number one. He was deeply involved in the occult. And there's other things that I could say that I don't have time to go into now. So the basic strategy they used, and it came from Freud, was that, the father of psychoanalysis, was that whenever a human being represses their sexual urges or their sexual desires, when anybody suppresses or restricts or does not act on their sexual desires and suppresses them, it will lead to a serious psychological problem. And a number of the Marxist intellectuals at the Frankfurt School actually authored books called The Totalitarian Personality, the totalitarian personality. And what they argued was that totalitarian males, strong leaders, or the fear of Hitlerian type dictators, that comes out of a psychological problem because that individual is suppressing their sexuality. So this is an entire theory that's not an honest psychological theory. There's no psychological basis for it. There's no scientific proof for it. What the Frankfurt School Marxist intellectuals did was manufacture a psychological theory as a methodology of propaganda and psychological warfare to target and destroy any strong male leadership figure so that there would be no resistance to their communist revolution. So every single argument, and by the way, I went through the entire biography of Trump. I read the articles in the liberal magazines, and you could go off the checkpoint that they would say was part of the reason he has an authoritarian personality. His father was cruel to him. Well, his father wasn't cruel to him. So they back then were constructing this fiction that Trump is a potential authoritarian and also mentally unstable, because they believe that goes hand in hand via the suppression of sexuality. So this is a specific agenda. And quite frankly, I heard this when I was a leftist and a radical and, involved in demonstrations and stuff. I heard this exact same argument from people like Dr. Timothy Leary and the radical left in the late 60s and 70s. That whole thing, make love and not war, was simply another way of saying, don't suppress your sexual urges, then you won't be violent. And so that's their attack strategy. And when you dissect the biographical components of Trump, that they add up in their erroneous attempt to portray him as a psychopath and mentally unstable. For example, I was raised in Queens, Jackson Heights, Queens. Trump was raised in Jamaica Estates, Queens. That was one subway stop from where I lived. The media in the East Coast portrays Jamaica Estates like it's Beverly Hills. Jamaica Estates is not Beverly Hills. I lived in a middle-class neighborhood. Trump lived in Jamaica Estates. It would be an upper middle-class neighborhood. It was not an elite, super wealthy neighborhood. It was just upper middle class. And his father told him many of the same things my father told me growing up in Jackson Heights, Queens. You know, you have to deal with the streets of New York. And he told his son to be tough, because if you weren't tough on the streets of New York City back then, they would beat the living daylights out of you just for sports. So he didn't have an authoritarian, psychopathic father. He had a loving father who was teaching him how to survive. Because if you didn't know how to survive on the streets of Queens, they would beat you unconscious. And my father said the same thing to me. And I don't have an authoritarian personality. That's an example of a loving father preparing his son for the real world. So that's just part of their psychological demonization, and they're going to add to it, and they planned it for a long time. The media, all these liberal magazines writing about Trump's childhood, writing about Jamaica Estates, and what I think is very humorous is it's blatantly obvious to me and anybody who grew up in Queens that the people writing these articles either were raised in privileged suburbs across America or the very privileged and posh areas of Manhattan, where they were wealthy kids, okay? And they didn't have to deal with this. But middle-class kids or working-class kids did have to deal with it in Queens. And just because Trump was upper middle class didn't make him immune from the streets of Queens. So I was a nice kid. I really was. I mean, I knew how to fight because I hung out with buddies where all we did was fight and train each other how to fight, as we also played football and basketball and stuff like that. And that really was very good for me because it taught me how to be a street fighter without being like, a psychopath. So anyway, I remember one day a kid picks a fight with me because I never picked fights with people. But if they picked a fight with me long enough, then I would engage them. So I was young, and this kid starts to beat me up. And I go into our apartment building kind of crying and complaining to my dad that it hurts. He beat me up, and and I'm crying and falling apart. And my father says to me, and he's a military veteran, and he was an artist, and he said to me, "So what if it hurts?" I mean, very aggressively, my father looks me in the eye and says, "So what if it hurts, Paul? He says, I don't care how much it hurts. Go back out there and finish the fight and win. And I don't want to see you until you do that." Now, that's kind of the edge that Trump's father gave him. But you see, you had to have that to survive. I would walk on the way to school, minding my own business, to grammar school, PS 69. These kinds of things would happen all the time. All of a sudden, guys are jumping out of the bushes. I never saw them before. And they are pounding the living you-know-what out of me. I'm bleeding. I'm knocked to the floor for no reason whatsoever. So if a father didn't teach his kid, his son, how to survive, his son would be just a target. And, when you grow up in a privileged upper Manhattan environment, of course, you don't have to deal with that. I would venture to say that if he had the political, economic beliefs that they had, he'd be a hero to them. You have to ask yourself the question. We have never, ever experienced this level of attack and warfare against any president of the United States in the history of America. Never, ever. And we have entered an entirely different virtual reality. And a lot of people understand that. A lot of people in the media don't get it yet. We've, like, I don't believe in evolution, but we've taken an evolutionary jump in the way our social media and our media integrates with society. So let me give you an example. Trump was a reality TV star, okay? That's unreal, but it's real. His face was recognizable. His brand, you're fired, the tough businessman. People all over the world tuned into that show. He was a superstar of reality TV. And that taught him a bunch of things, I'm sure. So Trump goes into an environment expecting to run for president and expecting, fair debate rules and fair media coverage and everything else. And all of a sudden, we're all watching this, and none of us have ever seen an election where the entire mainstream media is a 24/7 assault machine against him. They're lying, they're distorting. It's like unbelievable. You had people like Jeb Bush, coming up all like humble and quiet and Christian-like. But, as Trump called him on it, he was distancing himself from it. But he had a political pact, I think, spending over $100 million doing the dirtiest and meanest name-calling television spots. And so all this accumulates. We've never seen, ever, none of us have ever seen a time where the media has been so biased, so off the wall, one lie after another. What they did to Trump, and this is psychological warfare too, this is an intentional strategy. They have given him bombardment of images where people are threatening to kill him, threatening to assassinate him. Some of them are celebrities, some of them are movie stars, some of them are journalists and other politicians. And never before have we heard hundreds of voices calling for his bloody assassination and his killing, okay? If that had been any other political leader or president, those people would have been arrested by now, jailed, fined. Any other president. If somebody said that once to Obama, proceedings would have happened. So then it keeps escalating and escalating. And they're showing a picture of Trump's head being chopped off, like ISIS cut off his head, covered with blood that, what's her name, Kathy Griffin, the comedian, held up, which was obscene. It was brutal. It was completely off the charts. And then you see this play in Central Park where the actor who was playing Trump is assassinated and he dies in a bloody pool of blood. And that's just part of what they've shown. So here you have Melania Trump and you have Trump's younger son, Barron, and the rest of his family. Now, imagine the psychological assault on a female and a wife like Melania and Barron. Trump is tough, but no matter how tough you are, it gets under your skin. And then when your wife is being hit by it and your kid, it really gets under your skin. So, in a sense, I don't know exactly what their psychological state of mind is, but I don't care how tough you are, as a male or a female, when you're under that bombardment of violent imagery of the husband you love or your father being brutally murdered, and it's popping up on TV screens all the time. Imagine their lives. They go in Manhattan, they can't go anywhere. They're called names, there's murmuring in the background. I guarantee you all their liberal friends have run from them. She never knows, and the family never knows. He never knows where they're going to go, where somebody is going to explode on them, threaten violence or whatever. Now, that sounds, okay, that's the way it is. No, that's not the way it is. It's such a shock and awe campaign to our human psychological personality that, once again, I don't care how tough you are, it gives you degrees of incremental post-traumatic stress disorder, except it's not post. You're going to have nightmares. You're going to have sleepless nights. You're going to have a paranoia because it's like shell shock. You don't know when the next explosion is going to go off. And that is a brutal, brutal psychological attack on his family and him and his staff. And it's done intentionally because they know he is probably tough and can handle it. But his wife and son and family, that's a way to get to a man. So this is a deliberate assault. Number two is the constant references to assassination and the blood regarding Trump and how we're going to kill him and chop his head off. It takes a collective toll, and it deliberately creates a climate where every nut is ready to go off on them. So it is my personal belief that we are watching not a product of randomness. Everything we're seeing in the media in terms of the attacks on Trump, even this guy who killed the Republicans, there is far more to that than we're being led to believe. That was not a random incident. I'm going to say some things that probably I shouldn't say, but I'm going to say them anyway. Before I say them, though, I want to tell skeptical people, and there's nothing wrong with being skeptical, as long as you're honest, and when you're confronted with the facts, if the facts don't prove to be true, then you have a right to reject it. But if you're skeptical and the facts are true, you're obligated to change your mind if you have any integrity. So I'm going to say some things that may sound foreign and strange to some people, but I have credible firsthand documentation in my books to support what I'm saying. And, I've spent a lifetime, 45 years at least, studying this stuff. So let me just get to some basics that the mainstream news media and even a lot of the alternative news media is very one-dimensional, and they won't get into the real. It's not so much what they do cover that creates bias and censorship. It's what they choose not to cover, which is their greatest crime. Over the last 40 years, let's say I'm just going to pick an arbitrary date. I could go back further, but let's starting right after World War II in 1948, when America brought in 10,000 Nazi mind control scientists, Nazi rocket scientists, and Nazi genetic scientists under a program called Operation Paperclip, and then gave them the highest positions in America with think tanks and laboratories and huge budgets. Now, the one thing we have to remember about the Nazis is they were, first of all, deeply involved in the occult, but secondly, they were on the cutting edge of scientific mind control. I mean, they had mind control. They took it to a whole new level. But what a lot of people don't understand is that scientific mind control, just like genetics or transhumanism or computer technology, it has been accelerating in its sophistication and application. It's just that you'll never really hear about it. A case in point would be, what was it, a couple of months ago, our government gave the communist Chinese government the control over the internet. So immediately after that happened, I began to notice all kinds of censorship happening on the internet. Things that weren't happening before are now happening constantly. So for example, it used to be I would type in something like, let's say, Donald Trump and psychological personality or whatever. And on the first page, there would have been the typical liberal propaganda. But on the first page of a search engine back then, like Google, there would be alternative news. Now, on any given subject, unless it's the official politically correct version, you don't see it on the first page of the search engines. You don't see it on the second page. Now you've got to start going 10 pages deep. Maybe you'll go on the sixth page and find one article or something, but they're burying alternative viewpoints, which happen to be the truth, deep 10 pages or more into the search engines. That's a form of censorship. Then I can't tell you how many articles that I research, and I'll try to go to the article, and there's an error message, a variety of strange error messages that I've never seen, or mysteriously, this video does not play anymore. But it's always related to something that isn't politically correct. So what they're doing, it's a somewhat stealth way of doing it, is that they're dominating in a Orwellian sense, a Big Brother sense, the internet by redirecting people to politically correct information or blocking people from accessing, because the pages don't exist on the internet, truthful information. So this is very dangerous because this is Big Brother totalitarianism on the fast track. Now, let's go back to this attack and assault on Trump. A lot of people don't understand, why is Trump doing what he's doing? Like when he was in the election cycle, why did he give everybody these names? People are saying that's beneath a president. You know, he's calling Little Rubio, and I forgot all the Lion, Ted, and stuff. And you say, and a lot of people made the assessment, well, that's just beneath him. He's not acting presidential. But as I said earlier in your program, he called Jeb Bush a name. He did it intentionally because Jeb is pretending to be this virtuous Christian saint at the debate. But in reality, he's got his super PAC spending hundreds of millions of dollars lying and assaulting Trump and calling Trump all kinds of names. So he's not clean at all. So Trump doesn't have that money, but he does have an imagination. And from like a straight from the heart street fighting modality from Queens, he works out this clever way of labeling his candidates with these names. And you may say it's beneath him, but look, he doesn't have $500 million to play with to hire psychological operations advertising campaigns. So he has to do it with his own cleverness and wit. And that's one of the reasons he won the presidency. So Joe Scarborough and what's her name? Mika Brzezinski. Yeah. And Brzezinski, of course, is the daughter of this evil architect of the Trilateral Commission, Zebedee Brzezinski, who wrote in 1976, he wrote a book called The Grand Chess Game, calling for the use. Here is Brzezinski, Trilateral Commission, globalist, friend of Rockefeller. He's writing this super authoritarian book that we can control the masses with scientific brainwashing and psychotronic weapons and psychotronic technology. Now, I explain what all that is. The key thing here is I give you the first-hand quotes from Brzezinski and the others about their calling for the use of scientific mind control and psychotronic weapons. Now, I would suspect the majority of people that are listening don't know what psychotronic weapons are, but they're being used against you. You need to know that. See, you need to know that there is technology that most of America thinks is going to not be available until 100 years, and they would consider it science fiction technology that has really been available and operational since the 50s. And Brzezinski is talking about the use of psychotronic technology and psychotronic weapons in controlling the masses. So this is being employed in the psychological warfare with Trump and the globalist elite. And by the way, this is what this all really comes down to. It's because Trump ran on a platform, Make America Great Again. He ran on a platform against the corrupt trade treaties. He ran on a platform challenging globalism. He ran on a platform advocating borders and protection of terrorism. And he ran on a program where he wasn't going to allow the working class and the middle class of America to continually have their wages cut lower and lower and lower, because the globalists did that intentionally And then the globalists sent out 80,000 manufacturing plants to third world nations. And the reason for that, and this thinking and this plan that I'm talking about now from the globalists, they wrote about it extensively. And I quote them, going back as far as the mayor of New York City in 1921 and Woodrow Wilson and many others. They talked about the need for globalism. Rockefeller, there's been so many Rockefellers, but they talked about the need for getting rid of, for promoting trade treaties, for increasing globalistic trade, getting rid of borders, pushing a global government. They talked about this. They laid out and mapped out these plans 100 years ago. Now, so here Trump comes, and he is in opposition to it. But we have to understand that the mainstream media, not every single person, but just about every single person, there are a few exceptions, in the mainstream media is a bought man or a bought woman. They work directly for just 6 globalist corporations. And what is hidden behind the 6 globalist corporations is that these 6 globalist corporations that can totally control the content of our media, they're really owned by international and foreign investors and foreign directors, like nations like Saudi Arabia, China, certain European nations. So the globalists in all these other nations have purchased control and censorship over the content of our media. So the reason right now that our mainstream media is in a full-on attack mode against Trump, they're acting like packs of wild dogs infected with rabies devouring one another, or like some kind of zombie apocalypse in that movie 28 Days Later. They are doing this because they've been ordered to do it. They have been ordered by their globalist owners to take down Trump. And then there's people that are involved in it, because we have to remember that basically the protective mechanism that the globalists have erected, that goes back to ancient Babylon, by the way, is a pyramidical structure. The pyramidical structure is the structure or hierarchy of a corporate organizational flowchart, but all the secret occult societies, et cetera, operate on a pyramidical structure. So the people at the top, they know what's going on, okay? But then you go lower, and by lower, I'm saying like people like presidents of the United States, or people like prime ministers, or people like Marxist college professors and scientists. They only have a small fragment of the information. They're completely unaware of, for example, what Brinsky was talking about, psychotronic weapons. So you have them, they have been ordered to take down Trump because the globalists perceive Trump as a threat to their one world government and to their trade treaties and to globalism, et cetera, et cetera. When you read the Bilderberg report from the recent Bilderberg meeting in Chantilly, Virginia, where the world's elite gather annually in different locations, every single item, including the first one, was all about Trump. All about Trump, how to defeat populism, how to promote globalism. They are terrified that there will be a populist uprising that could potentially derail their plans for globalism. Now, I want to add one more ingredient here that people need to be aware of, and that is the reality of existing technologies. First of all, linguistics, vocabulary, words, images, and associations are a big part of what's called propaganda, persuasion, indoctrination, or psychological warfare. But in addition to that, and Brzezinski wrote about it in 1976, he's the co-founder of the Council of the Trilateral Commission with Rockefeller. They learned the beginning of it from the Nazis, mind control scientists, but they've taken it to an entirely new level. So we have intelligence agencies and activist groups financed by super billionaires that have been able to create regime change in Middle Eastern nations and coups. And the way they do it is they flood that nation with radical activists trained, and then they use the social media like Facebook and Twitter and all the other internet social media, and they can in a matter of 3 days have 100,000 people rioting and burning and destroying things in the streets. But they use a psychological technique and strategy in combination with the technology of the internet. Now, that psychological strategy, and your listeners need to know what it is because it's going to be used on them. And that's why you need to study, whether it's my books or somebody else's books, you need to study. I have it in my book, the new one that you can order now, Conquering the Matrix, this illusion world. They're using a strategy called emotional contagion. And the premise is that emotions and psychological states like anger, paranoia, violence, hatred, whatever you want to, whatever state of emotion you want to spread like wildfire through a targeted population, it acts like what they call a mental virus or an emotional virus. And it moves from person to person very rapidly. But when you initiate or launch the psychological operations strategy called emotional contagion, which is a virus that transmits emotions, hatred towards Donald Trump or whatever they want to do, when you introduce the components of emotional contagion into the internet structure, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, then it spreads virally. And virally isn't just a cute word, virally, an emotion that becomes through psychological development and methodically thought out, spreads virally on the internet through social media to a target group, and it is contagious. It spreads from one person to another. And then the second thing is it creates a group mind. It creates a mass hysteria that reinforces one another. And I'm going to suggest to you that when I saw the whatever how many million woman march in Washington, D.C., was either shortly before or after Trump was in the White House, and as I've watched some of the behaviors at these rallies and specifically watching the behavior of many celebrities and at these demonstrations in groups, I noticed something very peculiar. I've noticed that for years they have been politically active and expressing their viewpoints. But I'm seeing the emotionalism that almost borders on psychosis. It's a hysteria. You can listen to them on television and they're like psychologically out of control and they're like spinning off one another. And I'm going to suggest to you, I can't prove it as an outsider, but I'm going to suggest to you that population group has been targeted along with professional organizers of demonstrations and big money behind it, that an emotional contagion was launched virally in the feminist community and in the Hollywood community to create a catharsis and a total explosion of hatred, irrationality, and insanity in their protesting of Donald Trump. And it has reached such an escalation point. This emotional contagion keeps building and strengthening itself that it ended up with people like Kathy Griffin showing the decapitated head of Donald Trump and a lot of very freaky, psychotic stuff. But what I'm trying to tell your listeners, this is not an accident. This is how they destabilize targeted regimes in the Middle East and Europe. And this is how they intend to attempt to impeach a legally elected president who's guilty of nothing, or to get away with calling him mentally ill or whatever. They're using a full spectrum of assault weapons. And one of those assault weapons is the synergistic combination between social media, the internet, and very sophisticated emotional contagion, psychological propaganda that is targeted for a particular group. One of the most important components of this, and that is the strategic planned destruction of individual identity and individualism and the individual personality, and deliberately through psychological manipulation, getting rid of the individual personality and causing people to merge their identities into what's called the collective or the group mind, of where you're just one entity. And if you study the teachings of the Luciferian Alice Bailey and Madame Blavatsky, which I write about in the first book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, she points to this. Karl Marx points to this when in the Communist Manifesto, he talks about the collective and that nobody's individual personality matters. You give up everything for the state or the collective. And now our children are being programmed in the schools. You don't pursue individual excellence based on individual performance. The goal is they would rather have mediocrity and have children surrender to the group mind, where your identity is found not in who you are, but is being part of the team or being part of the consensus. And they also penetrated the capitalist corporations in America through management training. And they have things like total quality management, where they go into giant automobile companies, et cetera, and they discourage individual high achievers. They say that destabilizes productivity. And they say it's better to have everybody united and operating at the same level and making teamwork and groupthink your priority. They teach these corporations that that should be your goal, and that you don't want the independent achiever that soars to great heights. Because you see, the brainwashing, the indoctrination, the advertising, whatever you want to call it, began in school, K through 12. So people were already pre-set up to accept it. Now we're moving into a crisis state regarding Trump and everybody else. And the seeds that were already planted in tens of millions of lives or hundreds of millions of lives, they're already pre-prepared to enter into this collective mindset where they will succumb to brainwashing and act as such. But there's a powerful solution to that. And by the way, what I find amusing is that ultimately it's Luciferian in nature. But number two, they never tell you the truth. They say, okay, we're going to create a workers' paradise. Globalism is for the good of all of mankind. We're going to take care of everybody. We're going to redistribute the wealth so everybody has equal. And this whole list of things that sound so Christ-like and so compassionate. But history shows us it's always a lie. And when the day is done, including right now, there's proof of it. When the day is done, the wealthy 1% elite become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier and more powerful and more powerful and more powerful, while under this so-called wealth redistribution, they have said in their own words that they want to destroy the income levels of the working class in America and the middle class and bring the working class and middle class of America down to that of a third world nation. Now, in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, and this is a completely new book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, 2016, 2017, I go through all the economics, the numbers, the data that will prove what I'm saying. It's simple to understand, but when you look at the dollar amounts, it'll blow your mind. So a prophecy of the future of America 2016, 2017 is completely different than just a prophecy of the future of America. In a prophecy of the future of America 2016, 2017, I deal extensively with dollar amounts, economics, trade treaties, wealth, the decline in wealth of the middle class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I explain it in a very simple, anybody can read it and get it. So since 1960, I would say 1960 and even after that, the way it used to work in America was that the average guy, no matter what kind of job he had, let's say back then the average guy, or some of the average guys, they were car salesmen, okay? Or maybe they were salesmen at Sears, or any number of professions, okay? They made, in the 1960s and afterwards, for quite a few years afterwards, maybe even until the 70s, they were able to earn enough money working as a salesman at Sears or a car salesman and many other types of jobs in that level, where they could afford to buy and then own their own home. Their wives didn't have to work unless they wanted to, and they lived good lifestyles as working class and middle class Americans, okay? Because the buying power, first of all, they were making, I remember talking to guys on car lots, decades ago, who were making, back then, they were the goods car salesmen, but they were making $150,000. There were guys selling stereos and TVs all over the US who were making 75, 100,000, 125,000. And these were just like a little bit above average. But back then, their wives didn't have to work. They could buy their own home. They could take a vacation. But then the value of the dollar, essentially now by the time we're in, and this is a rough estimate, is worth more than, it's probably worth 60% less than it was in the 1960s. So now, to achieve the same standard of living, if it's possible, both the man and the woman have to work. And I have no problem. If a woman wants to work, she should be free to work. But now both the woman and the man both have to work, and they still don't make enough money combined to equal what one guy was making being a salesman at Sears. Because you can look at so many studies and so many reports of these globalists and these thinkers. And I quote all of these things in the various books, like The Day the Dollar Died also. They put down in bullet points their goals. And so number one is destroy Christianity. Number two is to destroy the Christian family unit. And they knew, see, feminism, look, nobody's against a woman having the freedoms to become everything she wants to be. If a woman wants to work, fine. Whatever a woman wants to do, that's fine. But she shouldn't have to be forced to do it. And so the reason that the secretive occult elite and globalists deliberately created the feminist movement, and by the way, it's not an accident that it was called the Women's Liberation Movement, because whenever you hear the word liberation and movement, that's a communist term. The whole purpose of feminism, and Gloria Steinem, who is probably the most famous feminist in history, including Betty Friedan and others, she was the publisher of MS Magazine, and she was the most prominent feminist. She came out and admitted that she worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, I'm going to say something to you because this is very important, and it reflects my mindset. I am very, very skeptical. People may say, well, he doesn't sound skeptical. He's espousing these science fiction technology theories. Yeah, I am. But the only problem is I'm right. It's true. And I've done my homework. But I'm skeptical. So everything that we're talking about at one time I didn't believe. I was skeptical. I was resistant. And so when I heard that for example, that the feminist movement was raised up to destroy the family, I didn't believe that. It sounded like a bunch of John Birch Society propaganda. I didn't believe it. And then I heard somewhere on the radio that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was deliberately funding women actresses and celebrities to act as role models and role model before all the other women in America, because of their celebrity status, how great it is to be a single working woman, not married, to be sexually liberated, and to be free. And so the Rockefeller Brothers Fund deliberately wanted to promote the ideal to the average American woman that the best choice for them was to be a working woman, to be single, to be sexually active. Marriage was not important, and having children certainly wasn't important. And so they wanted to brand that into the mindset of American women. Now, I thought this is crazy talk. That was my reaction. This is some conspiratorial, crazy nut job talk. I don't believe it. Well, so I go, back then there's no internet to research on. So I go to the local public library. And for those that remember what that was like, I went through the card catalog just to see. I would never have ever thought that they had a volume from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And I actually found an original volume published by the Rockefellers Fund themselves, not some secondhand copy. When I opened it, I rented it from the library, and it said everything that I just told you, how they were funding the promotion of television women stars, female TV stars, and they wanted to promote the role of the happiest woman is the liberated woman who is single, sexually active, not married, and doesn't want to have children. And there in my own eyes, I see the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is spending a fortune infiltrating the entertainment industry, using the entire mainstream media to promote this new vision of womanhood. Any depiction on television sitcoms, primarily, but movies, Archie Bunker or All in the Family was probably the most famous one. The male authority figure in a nuclear family that is religious is a bigot, a buffoon, stupid, a racist, and kind of a pathetic moron. And it began with All in the Family. And even in the sitcoms today, you either see there's no strong, positive male role model. There's no positive family unit with a healthy male role model. The woman is always the head of the household, because usually in the sitcoms, the man's incompetent of leading. And that is done on purpose because it erodes the authority of a male. And so they can continue on with their social conditioning, because their end game is not that. Their end game is to obliterate and completely destroy marriage completely. I mean, just blow it apart. Now, we're several phases of psychological indoctrination later into the game. And again, it's all about repetition. So without having to explain it endlessly, you saw in the movies and in sitcoms, and I've noticed especially in what they call chick flicks, romantic comedies, the level of sexuality, to me, is way above the level of sexuality than like in an adventure film. And the myth that is always shown in films and television is two strangers meet, and within 3 seconds, or a very close period of time, within 3 hours or 3 seconds or whatever, they're off to hop in bed with one another. They spend more time, standing in Subway at a line to get a Subway sandwich to think about what they're going to order than they do hopping in bed with somebody. And then they always show an unrealistic, glamorized depiction of some kind of sexual activity, which is not necessarily explicit, but it conveys fireworks, romance, incredible fun. But then they always neglect to show the aftermath. Occasionally, you'll see in the comedies the guy leaves early in the morning, he sneaks out, but you never see the unwanted pregnancies. You never see the depression of the girl or the guy who actually liked that person, but they're destroying, by making sex as commonplace as having a sandwich, they're destroying the family unit. And then through repetition, this becomes the norm. In the same way, alternative versions of sexuality are now being pumped at us, shoved in our face on every sitcom, every film. And the name of the game is through constant repetition, even though your conscious mind will reject it. If you see it enough repetitively, your subconscious mind will accept it and it will change your behavior. And when you read their exact quotes going back to the late 1800s, starting in the early 1900s, and I have the quotes in like Mass Awakening and the other books, you will be stunned to see how they knew in advance, leading globalists, thinkers, and one world government people, they planned in advance for racial conflict and racial wars. In fact, that was one of their playing cards that they expected to play because it was so easy. You cause different racial groups to have a tremendous animosity and you bring them into conflict. And then the Hegelian dialectic of creating two opposites for the purpose of bringing them to a middle ground, you have them fight each other, which is a manufactured crisis. And according to their spiritual template, because all of this stuff at the highest level always emanates from like Freemasonry or the Illuminati or Skull and Bones, et cetera, et cetera. At the highest level, they want crisis. And manufactured crisis is a Marxist term, but another substitute for crisis is chaos. And chaos is more of, that's the motto of the Freemasons, order out of chaos. Or you could say new world order out of chaos. So you create an environment where you have this like civil war in America based between these warring ideological and racial groups. They tried to do that in the election. Everything we saw was a trial run towards that. All of those riots in the various inner cities, and I'm not saying that there wasn't a legitimate reason for complaint when innocent African-American men were shot for no reason by the police. There's no excuse for that. But at the same time, there were cops that were shot and people that were shot that were innocent by individuals in the African-American community. But what happened is the media began to magnify it, distort it, replay it so many times that once again, they used television images, video replays to create this explosive emotional state of anger and violence, which we could call an emotional contagion. And then they spread it virally across the internet to certain demographic groups. So they were able to, for example, when anything would happen in any city, they were financed by billionaires. They had their organizational team on the ground there. And if you looked at the television images, these were white women in their 40s and 50s. These were trained radical activists who knew how to incite a demonstration. You had the people there because they were called there by social media, and you had them whipped into a frenzy because of the images and videos they were watching on social media. So there is a certain element that wants to destroy America by creating a civil war and this violent confrontation for the express purpose of the global elite stepping in, declaring martial law, a police state, UN troops or whatever. And what your listeners really need to understand, is that if we allow an escalation of that nature, and if there's anybody who's a conservative or whatever who is participating in an escalation that would lead to a conflict of that nature, the only people that will lose are people like Christians, the remnant church, people who believe in the Constitution and patriotism. It is those people that will lose because it's a trap. It's cheese bait for conservatives and Christians to pull them into something that will only invite martial law. Let me say this, and I quote him a lot extensively because this particular author that most of you are familiar with, I write about him extensively in all my books, and I quote him because he probably is, in my opinion, the foremost authority of anybody in predicting this and knowing what was going to go on. And that's Aldous Huxley, who was the author of Brave New World. And he also wrote Heaven and Hell and the Doors of Perception. He came to the U.S. in Laurel Canyon up on Lookout Mountain, where I used to live, in 1936 to infiltrate Hollywood and to get them involved in the Dionysian satanic cult of ISIS and to use the psychedelic drug mescaline. And then he came back years later, and by then his novel Brave New World talks about a futuristic dictatorship built on genetic engineering and scientific mind control. But he began to talk a lot about effective scientific mind control. And I quote his entire remarks in my book, the first one, A Prophecy of the Future of America. And what he said to a convention of neuropsychiatrists at the University of Berkeley in 1961 was this. He said, in the truly effective scientific dictatorship, people will not even know that they're slaves. They'll actually think they're free. And then he said, in the truly effective scientific dictatorship, you can program men and women to actually love their slavery. And he was kind of rebuking the boots on the ground and militarized vehicles, as that's like the Fred Flintstone way of accomplishing a dictatorship. If you create a scientific dictatorship and you do it effectively, the people have no idea that they're living under a dictatorship. They think they're free. They don't understand that they're slaves, and they are happy with their slavery. That's where America is moving. But unfortunately, I don't think, not that I'm for dictatorship, I think there's a lot of people in America, perhaps in our governmental structures, who are not as smart as Huxley was. And so they'll go for the old-fashioned way of guns, bullets, and actual physical concentration camps, only because they're stupid. I mean, if they really paid the price to know how to be effective totalitarians, they would choose Huxley's way. I laugh, I was debating on Fox and all that other stuff, and I would debate African-American activists who are African-American. And, I don't take prisoners on a debate on like Fox television. I wouldn't go on today on CNN because it's rigged. They just cut my mic, so I'm not going to waste my time. But, I would take no prisoners. I wouldn't lose control, but believe me, if you debated me, you would probably be crawling out of the room. So this girl was playing the race card on me, okay, and trying to get leverage in the debate by playing the race card. And so then I just flat out told her my personal story of being made an honorary member of the Black Panther Party. She thought I was lying, but as I went on, it was obvious I wasn't lying. But she didn't have the first clue about the history of the Black Panthers and whatever. So these people are like these millennials in this generation. They're programmed, and they don't even have any depth to their programming. But I want to add something here. I would suggest to people to always think through their strategy and say to themselves, no matter what it is, if I say these words, or if I undertake these actions, or if I do this, or if I do that, take the time to play out the various consequences of what you're going to do. And that's like the beginning of wisdom, because if you're embarking on anything or saying something which is going to produce the opposite of what you want, then you're being stupid and you're being lazy, and you can't win the battle. You can't. The goal is not to just communicate. The goal is to be effective in the communication. So here I want to introduce a spiritual note to this entire thing. We have to, the advantage that we have, and it really is a huge advantage. We have the advantage that we don't live in a godless universe produced by humanistic evolution and random chance. We live in a universe where there exists an infinite personal living God of the universe. So we can't just treat that like, some religious icon. We have to understand the reality of that, and then how to apply the reality of that into what I call, and I go into detail in this in my book that you can pre-order now, Conquering the Matrix. I played around with the titles. I didn't like Escaping the Matrix. I didn't like all the other titles that I was thinking of, because it was like a victim mentality. I'm into conquering the matrix, not escaping the matrix. So we live in a matrix, this illusory world, this artificial reality, this media programming. So we have an advantage, and that advantage I would call invisibility. Now, in the military, they use a term called full spectrum dominance. And the basic idea is that the goal of our military is to be dominant in every military theater or spectrum. So we're dominant on the seas, we're dominant in outer space, we're dominant in the ground, we're dominant in cyber warfare, psychological warfare. They call that full spectrum dominance. We're engaged in a conflict right now that is a battle for the heart and soul of mankind. If we fail to recognize that we are obligated, if we have any conscience at all, we're obligated to enter and engage in the greatest spiritual conflict for the hearts and minds of America since its founding. And the impact, or the end game of this battle, is going to affect the world for the next 10 years. And every one of us should be fully cognizant and recognize that fact. I'm going to say this very briefly. There were huge numbers of Christians and Catholics in Nazi Germany, but their faith was deprogrammed, so to speak, by the Frankfurt School Marxists, who deconstructed the Christians and the pastors' belief in their own Bible. So they indoctrinated them into believing Jesus Christ didn't resurrect from the dead, no miracles, no second coming. So basically, the elite brainwashed the Christians into practicing a powerless and non-real gospel. But isn't it interesting that simultaneously, during that exact same time period that the Christians were being castrated, the occult societies that put Hitler into power, like the Vril Society, Thule Society, and the other ones, they were teaching their disciples, their people, how to access supernatural power from another dimension, how to utilize this marriage of science and the power of the occult. So they weren't rejecting the supernatural. The occult secret societies that put Hitler into power were embracing the supernatural, but they deliberately neutered the Christians on purpose so it would be an unequal fight. Now, unfortunately, that same dynamic is occurring in America. Behind the scenes, satanic secret societies, witchcraft, occult, the Illuminati, skull and bones, and all kinds of things. So there's a real demonic spiritual component that is part of every conflict. But we have masses of Christians who are being indoctrinated to believe that their faith in Christ and the Bible is anemic, impotent, and doesn't work in the real world. And certainly you can't access supernatural power. But at the same time, the people involved in the occult or the Illuminati or whatever, they are teaching each other, they're developing and learning how to increase and increase and increase their access to raw supernatural power. And they're going to use it in a confrontation. Whatever confrontation comes will be more than psychological, it will be more than military, it will be more than economic. It will contain a supernatural dimension. So back to full spectrum dominance. And I deal with this in the first book of prophecy of the future of America. And without naming his name, I told you that the probably the most authoritative expert in the field of psyops, who's a Satanist, who was very high up on the NSA, had read my material, and we had some private discussions, and I'll leave it at that. And he understood better than any Christian that I've met that the psyops is the most important part of a warfare, because if you can convince your enemy it's useless to fight and you are going to lose, you've won the battle before it started. That psychological operation is being embedded in the consciousness of people who are patriotic, who love America, who love the Constitution, people who are Christians, et cetera, et cetera. Subconsciously, they're being embedded with the lie through psychological warfare that it's useless to take a stand to try to make a difference. And the most clever ploy of all is to wrap that fatalistic belief, to wrap it in theological terms and different perspectives on Bible prophecy. So, back to full spectrum dominance. The key is for any military to dominate every area in the battlefield. But you see, we have as an asset the asset of invisibility. Because of the deeply ingrained bias and prejudice and rejection of the very idea, the very belief, or the very notion that a God of the Bible actually exists, that Jesus Christ really did resurrect in history, and that there are angelic armies of God, and at a certain point, this one world government, one world religion, and one world economic system that the globalists want is simply a replay of what happened in Genesis 11, and that in the final analysis, Jesus Christ is going to return to planet Earth in a military fashion. Riding a white horse, he's going to descend from another dimension, the kingdom of heaven, and he's going to descend with the armies of heaven and very quickly destroy this entire Antichrist structure at the War of Armageddon, okay? Our job, if we interpret the Bible correctly, is to occupy the land, and God has given us the land of America, until he comes. Now, God did not give us the commandment to occupy the land of America until he comes, unless God already knew that he gave us a power of such a high level that we would be able to fulfill that commandment and truly occupy the land. So we need to recognize that God and Jesus, or God or Jesus, wouldn't have told us to occupy the land if he had not already given us the power to do it. So we already have the power to occupy the land. Now, back to the invisibility factor. We're fighting various enemies, but because of their bias, their prejudice, their humanistic beliefs, their atheism, their mockery of Christianity, etc., they truly cannot see the reality of the infinite personal living God of the universe and how God can be called upon to send his angelic armies into the earth. They think that's like, the Wizard of Oz story. They can't possibly believe that's true, okay? And so because it is impossible for them to believe that Christ is literally returning with the armies of heaven to defeat the Antichrist, and because it is impossible for them to believe, because of their prejudice and bias, that God answers prayer, they are blinded from the most powerful reality of all, which is the God of the universe, Jesus Christ, can be called on. His people can call upon God at this very moment. And if we call upon God in the proper way, which involves repentance and being very serious and exercising faith as we call upon God, God will send his angelic armies from heaven into the United States. He will send his power into the United States. He will shore up our current president supernaturally. And the tide of the spiritual battle will change. Despite the fact that they have all the money, all the technology, all the control, and all the power is irrelevant. Because the one asset we have that they don't believe in, and that's why it's a great asset to have. Your enemy doesn't believe that you have it, but we have it. The asset that we have is that we are in communication with the supreme being of the universe, who in his totality is more intelligent, more powerful than everything they have put together, including their god, Lucifer. So all we have to do to release this power is to simply have that childlike faith and believe God. See, the way you access the spiritual power is you believe God in faith, even if it's at the level of a mustard seed. Now, if we do that, and that's why I wrote the book, Conquering the Matrix, the way to conquer the matrix, this illusion reality, the way to win is not to be tempted to use the weapons they're using. We need to be aware of their weapons. We need to be physically involved, but our primary asset, where we have full spectrum dominant, the military theater that's most important on planet Earth right now is not the other military theaters. The military theater of the ocean and the seas and cyber warfare and nuclear warfare and ground troops and all these other things, those are very important military theaters. But combined, they don't even come close to the military theater that people don't believe exists. So it's invisible to them. That's our asset. And that is the military theater that has not only, it's a military theater, but it gives us the ultimate full spectrum dominance over every other military theater. And that is our relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, who's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the real ability to call upon his name, and the valid and real expectation that when we call upon his name, he will send his angelic armies and his power into the earth, and he will clothe his people with power from on high. When we access that with faith, at that moment, and that could happen today, tonight, it can happen when a gun is pointed to your head. That's up to the collective decision of your audience. The moment you do that, the moment you connect with God by faith, you change the direction of the battle. And for a temporal season, because we can't undo Bible prophecy, for a temporal season, God will grant us a long enough reprieve to drive back the powers of darkness, to reinforce and shore up our president, because God has a special plan for America that began with the Pilgrims and Puritans. America was called by God to preach the gospel into the world and to participate in the last days soul harvest. I believe in American exceptionalism. That's not vanity. That's true. America is an exceptional nation called by God for a special purpose in the last days. Now, I'm going to be very succinct. The special purpose that God has called America for and to in the last days has not been fulfilled by his people. Therefore, we haven't finished the mission. Therefore, everything's like in a holding pattern. When we choose, this comes down to individual response. It's great to talk about the world. It's great to talk about these global things. When at this moment they are confronted in their heart, mind, and soul, that they know without the shadow of a doubt that at this precise second, they are being confronted with the Spirit of the living God, and he is asking them individually to make a choice because he won't force them. And he's asking them, and they know it, they can feel it. The only people who don't know it and can't feel it are those who are proud or going to erect some kind of psychological defense mechanism. Anybody who has any integrity or honesty knows that the Spirit of God is touching them right now and requiring a decision. And the request that God has made is, I called you before the foundation of the world to be here for such a time as this. That means here in America, for such a time as this, for this spiritual battle. And I've already equipped you before the beginning of time with the talents, the gifts, and abilities to do your part in this spiritual battle. And the Lord is simply asking each person listening, are you willing to surrender your will to the will of God? Are you willing to stop playing around and actually enlist in an oath before God? People make pacts and oaths with Satan all the time. Are you willing to surrender your life to Jesus Christ? And are you willing, by an act of your will, to allow God's Spirit to fill you with his power and wisdom and grace to such an extent that you no longer will live the rest of your life as a mortal man or a mortal woman? You will discover that if you submit to the request of God, you will receive the power and wisdom you need to accomplish the warfare spiritually that he's calling you to accomplish. Look, I don't know how else to say it. God has called America from the beginning of time for a special mission. I don't care what the communists and the globalists say, trying to reduce America into nothing. America is unique because of its Constitution, its Bill of Rights, and all kinds of things. America is necessary in the plan of God for at least the temporal future. And we are being asked by God to be a light of the nations. You look at France and Germany and Europe, they're being overrun deliberately because of the plans of the globalists. Judeo-Christian society is being smashed into pieces by the hammer of forced migration and the forced entrance of militant Islamic extremists designed to be a Trojan horse by the globalists themselves to take down Judeo-Christian civilization. And in the ashes of the chaos and the violence that they are hoping will erupt, they will erect a dictatorship through the European Union that makes Adolf Hitler's dictatorship look like a Sunday school. So we are at an historic hour. There's no more games left to play. We are at the most important moment in history. At some time in the future, Christ is returning. But we don't have to worry about that. Christ is quite capable of getting here on time, all by himself. The question is, are each one of us willing to make that radical choice and quit playing games and all the rest of the stuff and get down to business? The other translation of Jesus Christ's command of occupy until I come, the other interpretation is do business until I come. Jesus meant do kingdom business until he comes. What is that? That means, what is the business of Jesus? Winning souls, preserving freedom, rescuing sex slaves, preserving righteousness and truth in America, shoring up our constitutional liberties, not allowing the evil one or a globalist elite or a George Soros to by default seize the land. Do you think for a moment that God is intimidated by George Soros? George Soros is a nanosecond away from a stroke or an aneurysm in the brain. I mean, he is living in a delusion because, in his own words, he called himself a god. He may be a formidable adversary to us as human beings, but he's an ant in the eyes of God. We need to stop being afraid of this person and that person and this organization and remember who we serve, and then be willing to go to battle in a law-abiding, peaceful manner, never seduced by violence and extremism. But we need to be ready to go to battle like David did. David went against a giant that was physically impossible for him to defeat. But he conquered that giant because he didn't go against it in his own strength, but in the power of the Lord. The horror is, and this is Luciferian, they repeat it over and over again. They want a hive mind. They want to destroy every person's individual personality. So think of every person listening. Lucifer wants to make you a blank state so that you don't even know who you are. You're just part of this organic hive mind machine. And only Lucifer could devise such a diabolical plan for mankind. They say, the John Lennon song, "Imagine there's a heaven." That was the anthem of the New World Order. Those are total lies. The New World Order is going to give you eternity in a hive mind where you have no soul, you have no identity, no personality. The entire thing is a lie.